I am 72 years old, a widow, and a grandmother. My name is Eleanor Parker, and for most of my life, I thought family was the safest place a person could ever be. I believed that no matter how difficult things became, your children would carry you through the storms, just as you once carried them. I truly believed that. But one morning, standing in the quiet of my own kitchen, I realized just how wrong I was. I can still see the way Jason and Brooke positioned themselves, one blocking the doorway and the other hovering near the phone, as if I were some prisoner in my own home. Their bodies said more than their words ever could. I wasn't free to choose anymore. In that moment, I felt something heavy settle inside me. There are phrases you never forget, things that stay echoing in your ears long after the room falls silent. I remember the chill that ran through me as I understood the meaning behind their smiles, their careful tones. It was the day I realized that my own son and his wife no longer saw me as family. They saw me as an obstacle. Back then, they believed I was powerless. They thought I was too fragile, too old, too easy to push aside. What they didn't know was that I had already started recording, quietly building the proof that would change everything. And to understand why, you have to know what life looked like before the cracks began to show. When my husband Frank passed away, I moved into Jason and Brooke's home at 72. I thought sharing a roof with them would be a way to heal. They had Aiden, a 16-year-old already saving for college, and Lily, just 13, who still slipped her hand into mine when we walked together. I believed I was helping them as much as they were helping me. I cooked dinners, folded laundry, and picked the kids up after school. In my heart, I thought I was giving love and receiving it in return. Jason, my son, always had an easy charm, the kind that could sell a car even when the engine coughed. But charm doesn't cover mortgage payments, and his dealership had been struggling for years. Brooke, polished and ambitious, carried herself like everything was under control. But her closets whispered otherwise. The designer bags, the perfectly tailored dresses, credit cards told the real story. For a while, I convinced myself the small comments about groceries and utility bills were nothing. Maybe they were just stressed. Maybe I was being sensitive. But then the tone shifted. They spoke about me like I was a line item, not a person. Little by little, I felt myself shrinking inside their home. One night, around midnight, I got up for a glass of water. The house was quiet except for the low murmur of Jason and Brooke behind their bedroom door. I didn't hear every word, but the meaning was sharp enough. They were considering a senior community for me, not because I asked for it, but because I had become too expensive to keep around. I stood in the hallway, chilled to the bone, realizing that my place in their home was conditional. That was the first fracture, the first sign of the life I thought I had beginning to crack. And once I saw it, I couldn't unsee it. As the weeks passed, I began to notice more than just offhand remarks. Papers left on Jason's desk revealed overdue balances, late notices, and credit card bills stacked like warning signs. They weren't just behind, they were drowning. Mortgage payments overdue, cars they couldn't afford, nearly $47,000 owed on credit cards. Suddenly, the way Brooke measured out groceries and the way Jason avoided long conversations with me made perfect sense. To them, I wasn't a mother or a grandmother anymore. I was a financial burden standing between them and survival. It was a devastating realization, one that made me feel smaller than I had in years. One afternoon, I found myself standing at the convenience store counter with a $5 bill in hand. I wasn't buying hope. I wasn't even buying a dream. I was buying defiance. That lottery ticket felt like the smallest rebellion, a way to tell the universe I wasn't just a cost on someone else's spreadsheet. When the numbers hit, my heart didn't leap with joy. It raced with strategy. I didn't think of vacations or mansions. I thought about power, the kind I had lost in my own home and had just been given back. I had a choice. Most people would have packed a bag and walked away that day. But I wanted something more than escape. I wanted justice. That's when I reached out to Miguel Alvarez, a local investigative journalist I had once seen speaking about elder financial abuse. Meeting him would change everything. And it was in that decision that my quiet defiance began to turn into a plan. Miguel and his team came while the house was empty. They worked quietly, slipping cameras into picture frames, microphones inside decorative bowls, wires hidden where no one would think to look. I remember watching them move with such calm precision. For a moment, I felt almost guilty, like I was betraying my own family. But then I reminded myself they were already betraying me. This wasn't revenge. This was protection. Once everything was set, Miguel suggested a test. A simple trick to see how Jason and Brooke would react to even the hint of money. That test came in the form of a phone call, a pretend sweepstakes win. Nothing outrageous, just $25,000 and a promise of $1,000 a week for life. I can still feel the shift in the air that day. The same people who only days before had pressed me about senior living and whispered about costs suddenly looked at me as though I was valuable again. Their tones softened. Their smiles grew warmer. But beneath it all, I could sense the calculation. They framed it as concern. They spoke about how overwhelming money could be for someone my age, how important it was to keep it safe, how a joint account would make everything easier. They even suggested a spending limit $500 for myself, while everything else would be managed as a family. On the outside, I nodded as though their reasoning made sense. On the inside, I was burning. I wasn't naive. I wasn't impulsive. I was their mother, not their ward. And now, I had proof of how quickly love could be twisted by the scent of money. The test had worked, but what came next would cut even deeper. The sweepstakes trick had opened the door, but what followed showed me just how far Jason and Brooke were willing to push. It didn't take long before their tone shifted again. This time, it wasn't only about protecting me from scams or guiding me with money. It became a full-blown campaign to pressure me out of my own life. They started speaking about senior communities as if they were luxury resorts. They painted pictures of activities, new friends, and independence. But I knew better. I could feel the edges of the trap. Independence was their word for isolation. A fresh start was their code for exile. When I didn't leap at the idea, the demands began to harden. They suggested that if I insisted on staying, I should contribute more, much more. $2,000 a month for the privilege of living under their roof, in a single bedroom, with the same chores and responsibilities I had always carried. I had been paying $800 already, more than fair for my space. They knew my Social Security barely covered that. The new number wasn't a request, it was eviction by math. Every time they circled back to the subject, I forced myself to stay calm. I cooked dinner as if nothing had been said. I folded towels. I kissed Lily goodnight. I asked Aiden about school. On the surface, I was the same grandmother I had always been. But inside, I was a steel wire pulled tighter with every conversation. The walls of choice were closing in. Either I surrendered or they would decide for me. And deep down, I knew the moment of confrontation was getting closer. It was early, around 7:15 in the morning, when the confrontation finally came. I was at the stove, stirring eggs, the kind of ordinary moment that usually carried peace. But this time was different. Jason planted himself at the doorway, and Brooke positioned herself near the counter where the phone sat. Their stance said everything. They were not giving me a way out. They laid out their case, not with raised voices, but with carefully chosen words and prepared documents. They had begun compiling notes, emails, and supposed signs of decline. They framed my independence as confusion, my resistance as paranoia. In their eyes, I wasn't simply stubborn. I was unstable. They even spoke of an emergency conservatorship, the kind that could strip a person of every decision in the space of a single court hearing. As they spoke, I stood there with the pan in my hand and thought about how easy it is to erase someone, not with violence, but with paperwork, a few signatures, a sympathetic lawyer, and suddenly a lifetime of choices is gone. The thought chilled me, and then came the darkest part. Hidden in their words was the insinuation I had been waiting to hear. The one that pierced straight through me, that sometimes elderly people who come into money don't last long. Accidents happen. The casualness of it was what struck me most. It wasn't shouted. It wasn't dramatic. It was delivered as if it were simply another option. That was when I knew for certain the danger wasn't only financial anymore. It was something far more threatening. And yet, even in that moment, I felt strangely calm, because I also knew I was ready for what came next. In that kitchen, with Jason blocking the doorway and Brooke hovering like a guard, I felt the weight of weeks pressing down on me. Their words had sharpened into threats. Their plans had grown bold. And then, in the quiet of my own thoughts, I realized the moment I had been waiting for had arrived. I turned my head ever so slightly toward the decorative bowl on the counter. Inside, it was a lens no one else knew about. My heart was steady, not racing. I didn't need to shout. I didn't need to fight. I simply let myself look into that hidden eye and ask the only question that mattered: did you get that? The silence afterward was thick. Jason's shoulders stiffened. Brooke's face drained of color. For the first time in months, I wasn't the vulnerable one in the room. I was the one holding the truth. Miguel stepped out from the pantry, calm and professional, confirming what I already knew. Every conversation, every manipulation, every plan had been documented. I explained, with a calmness that surprised even me, that in Colorado, a one-party consent state, recordings are legal if one person is aware, and I had been aware all along. It wasn't anger that filled me, it was relief. Finally, the balance had shifted. Finally, the burden of proof no longer rested on my memory alone. The masks had slipped, and there was no way for them to put them back on. But the story, as I would soon learn, was far from finished. After the reveal, the room felt different. The air was heavier, like everyone suddenly understood there was no going back. Jason sank into a chair, his head hanging in his hands. For the first time, his charm was gone. What I saw wasn't a salesman or even a son. It was a man broken under the weight of his own choices. Brooke, on the other hand, stood frozen, her face a mask of panic and defiance. I wish I could say I felt triumphant, but what I actually felt was a deep sadness. Yes, I had the proof. Yes, the truth was finally out in the open, but it came at a cost I had never wanted to pay. This was my family, my blood, and watching them unravel in front of me was a grief all its own. In their desperation, the truth of their lives spilled out. They were buried under debt, months behind on the mortgage, terrified of losing everything. It didn't excuse what they had done, but it explained the desperation that had twisted love into control. For a moment, I almost pitied them. Almost. And then my thoughts went to Aiden and Lily. They were good kids who didn't deserve the weight of whispered schemes or the shame of parents exposed. I thought about Lily's kindness, about Aiden's determination to work hard for his future, and I wondered how much of this would scar them. I had started this to protect myself, but as I stood there, I realized it was also about protecting them from the lies, the manipulation, and the legacy of greed. The damage was already spreading, and the consequences were only just beginning. In the days that followed, the ripple effects hit harder than even I had expected. Jason lost his job at the dealership almost immediately. A man facing charges of financial elder abuse was not someone they wanted representing their business. Brooke's company placed her on unpaid leave while they waited to see how the investigation unfolded. Their polished image, the one they had worked so hard to keep intact, cracked wide open. Neighbors who once waved from across the driveway now offered only tight smiles. Their conversations clipped and polite. Word spread quickly, as it always does in a community. Everyone knew what had happened. Everyone had an opinion. And while I hated the gossip, part of me understood it wasn't just our family anymore. It had become a story larger than us. Miguel and his team carefully assembled the footage. Networks had interest, but nothing would be shown until the legal system had its turn. I knew exposure would come, and I braced myself for what that would mean. In the meantime, I moved out. A hotel became my temporary home, a neutral place where I could breathe without tension pressing in from the walls. Eventually, with the help of a realtor, I found a modest 3-bedroom house only 10 minutes away. It wasn't grand, but it was mine. Big enough for Aiden and Lily to visit, small enough for me to manage alone. I remember standing in that empty living room, sunlight streaming through bare windows, and feeling both loss and freedom. This wasn't triumph, it was simply relief. And relief was only the beginning, because the real reckoning still waited in the courtroom. When the case finally moved into the courtroom, I felt as though I was walking into another kind of battlefield. The air was colder, the stakes heavier, and every word carried the weight of judgment. For 2 days, I sat on the witness stand, telling strangers how my own son and his wife had tried to take away not only my money, but also my freedom. It was exhausting to speak it all out loud, but at the same time, I knew the recordings spoke louder than my voice ever could. Jason's lawyer tried to paint him as a man under unbearable financial pressure, a son who made mistakes but never truly meant harm. Brooke's attorney tried another angle, presenting her as a wife swept along by Jason's desperation. Not someone who planned the schemes herself. Sitting there, listening, I couldn't help but think about how easy it is to twist a story when survival is on the line. But the prosecution was steady and simple. They showed the footage, step by step, until there was no space left for excuses. The jury didn't just hear the words, they felt the intent behind them. They saw the pressure, the manipulation, and the quiet threats that had been hanging over me for months. When the verdict was read, I didn't feel triumph. I felt sorrow. Jason was found guilty of conspiracy to commit financial elder abuse. Brooke carried the same charge, with an additional conviction for threats against an elderly person. Watching them in handcuffs was a moment I never imagined for my own family. This wasn't the kind of justice that made you cheer. It was the kind that left you silent, holding the cost in your chest. But even then, the story had another layer waiting to be revealed. For months, everyone believed that Little Sweepstakes' call had been the spark. Jason and Brooke clung to the idea that I had stumbled into a modest win and that greed had simply gotten the best of them. But the truth was something they never imagined. The sweepstakes was nothing but bait. The real prize had come earlier. I had walked into a convenience store with a $5 bill and walked out holding a ticket worth $63.4 million after taxes. That money had been sitting quietly in an untouched account while I lived under their roof, while I listened to their whispers, while I endured their pressure. I never told them, not because I was afraid, but because I wanted to see who they truly were when they thought I was vulnerable. I could have left the moment the winnings cleared. I could have bought a new home, cut ties, and disappeared into comfort. But deep down, I knew my story wasn't just mine. I wanted the truth captured, not just for me, but for every older person who has ever been treated like a burden or dismissed as incompetent. I wanted proof, undeniable and clear, of how quickly love can twist when money enters the picture. So I waited. I let them reveal themselves piece by piece. And when the mask finally fell, I was ready to show the world. It wasn't about wealth. It was about dignity. And with that revelation, my path became clear not just to survive what they had done, but to turn it into something larger than myself. After the trial, I faced a choice. I could let the story end with a courtroom and a guilty verdict, or I could carry it forward into something greater, sitting alone in my new home. I thought about all the letters I had already begun receiving from strangers. People recognized their own lives in mine. They had children pressuring them, relatives circling like vultures, neighbors questioning their competence. They needed more than sympathy. They needed help. So I used a portion of my winnings to create the Parker Foundation for Elder Justice. It wasn't about charity. It was about equipping people with the tools I had almost lost. We offered lawyers to fight fraudulent conservatorships. We paid for temporary housing when someone needed to escape a toxic household. We stood beside families, not to divide them, but to remind them that respect is not optional. In the first year alone, we helped 89 families. We challenged cases where the elderly were silenced and gave them back their voices. Aiden began visiting me at the foundation's office, eager to learn. Lily volunteered on weekends, her young hands sorting files with a seriousness beyond her years. Watching them, I felt hope grow where hurt had been, and that hope carried me into the final chapter of this journey. Looking back now, I understand that my story was never just about money. It was about something deeper, about dignity, trust, and the kind of love that family should embody, but sometimes fails to. At 72, I learned that age does not make you powerless. It makes you wise enough to fight differently. The lottery never truly changed my life. What changed my life was choosing to stand up when it would have been easier to stay silent. It was choosing to risk heartbreak in order to expose the truth. And through that truth, I found a strength I didn't know I still carried. Jason and Brooke paid their price, but in the end, it wasn't prison that mattered. What mattered was that their children saw the truth clearly. Aiden and Lily now understand that respect is not earned by fear or control. It's built through kindness, honesty, and patience. And that lesson may be the most valuable inheritance I could ever give them. To anyone listening, I hope you remember this: your voice matters. Even if people try to silence you, even if they dismiss you as too old, too fragile, or too small, you are never powerless. If my story resonated with you, I would love to hear yours. Share it in the comments. Pass this along to someone who needs courage today. And if you'd like to support more stories like mine, don't forget to like and subscribe, because together, our voices carry farther than we ever could alone.